Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Guys at Magic. This is Hunter and David. Say what up, David.
What's going on, guys?
We're back. This time, David's going to be taking us through his $300 upgrade to the Riveteers Rampage deck. But you've done it differently because of the 100 upgrade. We learned that you went with the Beamtown Bullies. So let's take it off from there. Tell me about the Beamtown Bullies once again.
So the Beamtown Bullies is a black, a red, and a green for a legendary creature, Ogre Devil Warrior. It's a 4/4 with Vigilance and Haste, and it has tap target opponent whose turn it is, puts target non-land or non-legendary creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. It gains haste, goad it. At the beginning of the next end step, exile it. Essentially, what you're going to be doing here is you're going to be giving your opponents things to hit each other with.
What's the reasoning behind the switch from the Face Commander toolbox?
Generally speaking, I felt that the Beamtown Bullies was a little bit more interesting to me, just kind of personally. I also just like the kind of odd reanimation style that he allows for. So I wanted to go ahead and make that change. The Toolbox Commander it didn't speak to me the same way.
Yeah, I think the Beamtown Bullies is unique in its own way.
Yeah, so if you haven't done so already, we did do a $100 video for this. I don't really want to dive too much in depth over the changes that we made in that, but it is important that we at least talk about some of the cards that we've included for that because we're going to be building off of the $100 upgrade. So for those of you who didn't check it out, essentially what we're going to be doing is putting in some cards into the deck that have some pretty big downsides. That way we can cheat them into play by reanimating them under our opponent's control and having our opponents deal with those downsides instead of us.
Seems like a pretty good plan.
So from the $100 video, some of the cards that we've included in here are the Leveler, Inverter of Truth, Hellcarver Demon, Pathrazer of Ulamog, Ulamog's Crusher, Ebon Blade Reaper, Eater of Days, and Malignus as our reanimation targets. To help us be able to set that all up and get those cards actually into the graveyard, we included cards such as Unmarked Grave, Buried Alive, Grizzly Salvage, Stinkweed Imp, Fauna Shaman, Entomb, Gerard's Orders, Dead Bridge Chant, and Golgari Grave Troll. Super important as well, we did also include kind of a backup plan in that in the form of Sneak Attack, Through the Breach, and then also Heartless Summoning. So those are some of the cards that we included for the $100 list. I don't really want to dive into what we took out of that, but it is super important that we at least kind of address the fact that those cards were included. And then, of course, by the way, if you guys are curious, you can go back and watch that video or check out the link that we have provided in that video to go and see the $100 list for the Moxfield link.
Yes, because this is the big boy list. We're adding even more toys to get to that $300 price point.
Yes, we are. And we're going to be adding some new, pretty fun stuff.
So let's talk about the additions of the new fun stuff.
So some of the things that we're going to be adding in, and what I want to kind of talk about first, are some of the additional kind of like oddball pieces or some of the additional utility things. And number one is the Despotic Scepter. This is a single mana for an artifact that has tap, destroy target permanent you own. It can't be regenerated. Since this says target you own and not that you control, it means that you can actually use this on some of those big beasts that you put under your opponent's control. So say, for example, you reanimate a Leveler and you kind of just nuke one of your opponents. You can then use the Despotic Scepter to destroy said Leveler, put it back into your graveyard, and then kind of reload your commander to use it up against another opponent later on.
That seems really good. You don't want to lose that Leveler, for example.
Well, it's just it's a little bit more redundancy. It's a little bit more redundancy. All right. Some of the other cards that we've included, and I'm just kind of calling these some new toys because I think for the most part, they're just generally fun. So next up, we have Hermit Druid. This is 1 and a green for a creature human druid. It's a 1/1, but we don't really actually care about its stats. It has pay a green, tap it, and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land card. Put that card into your hand, and all other cards revealed this way into your graveyard. Essentially, what we're hoping to do with this is be able to tap him, mill a ton of different stuff, or mill a bunch of our cards over into our graveyard, and that way we can kind of maybe hit one of those big creatures to then reanimate on our opponent's side of the board.
Makes sense.
Seedborn Muse is also going to be making the inclusion here. This is 3 a green and a green for a creature spirit. It's a 2/4 and it says untap all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. So this allows us to be able to untap our commander to potentially use him multiple times during a turn cycle. This also, if we have to spot Acceptor in play, will untap that as well, and that just combos really, really nicely together. Rift Sweeper is one of our kind of odd includes here, and he's kind of like a backup plan, or at least like a panic button in a way. He is a 1 and a green for a creature elf shaman. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose target face up exiled card. Its owner shuffles it into his or her library. If our opponents are going to start exiling out our graveyard, which in a game of EDH, they probably are going to start doing so, this is a way for us to be able to get some of our toys back, and hopefully, once we've been able to deal with the problems that they put up into play, getting rid of our graveyard, we can then reload our commander and use some of the other things again. The last card I have on this, or the last card I have in this section, is Combustible Gearhulk. This is a card that I wanted to include a little bit more creatures in this list that were just going to be some things that we were going to put on our side of the board, and we needed a little bit more draw. Plus the fact that so many of our creatures are really, really big and very high mana value, I figured this one might be kind of a fun inclusion. Combustible Gearhulk is 4 a red and a red for an artifact creature construct. It's a 6/6 with first strike, and it says whenever it enters a battlefield, target opponent may have you draw 3 cards. If the player doesn't, you mill 3 cards. Then Combustible Gearhulk deals damage to that player equal to the total mana value of those cards. We could potentially either be drawing 3 cards off of this. We also could potentially just be milling 3 cards, which is wonderful with our commander. And also, since we have some big fat creatures in this list, that could be very painful for some of our opponents.
Definitely. What else are we adding into this?
So, up next, I've got 2 cards that I do want to talk about. Both of these are creatures, and they kind of pose a little bit of a new problem for our opponents. Both of these creatures have relatively low toughness and kind of incentivize the opponent to block. So the first one of our 2 kind of extra fun creatures they're going to add in here is Master of Cruelties. This is 3 a black and a red for a creature demon. It's a 1/4 with first strike and death touch. It says it can only attack alone, and it also states that whenever it attacks a player and isn't blocked, that player's life total becomes 1. Master of Cruelties assigns no combat damage this combat. This is a creature that really heavily incentivizes our opponents to block and get in front of because they don't want to have that penalty. The other thing about this, too, is Master of Cruelties makes for a wonderful reanimation target because it can only attack alone. If we end up goading this under one of our opponent's control, it essentially forces them to only be able to attack with Master of Cruelties and makes the rest of their board just kind of chill for a little bit.
Yeah, as someone that runs Master of Cruelties in one of his decks, it is a very, very mean card.
Yeah, sadly, we're not going to be able to pull off any of its like combo potential. We're not running this in like an Alicia Who Smiles at Death or a Kalia deck where we're going to be able to do the 1/2 punch. But still, being able to nuke our opponent's life total down to 1 puts them in a very awkward situation. The next card here is Lightning Skelemental. This is a black, a red, and a red for a creature elemental skeleton. It's a 6/1 with trample and haste. It states that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice Lightning Skelemental. I love having this card in this deck. It's low to the ground. It also has a pretty high power ratio for it, so it's capable of getting in for a decent amount of damage. The disruption that it causes by making your opponent discard cards is fantastic, and if they do go to block it, it's gonna die. So if you give this to one of your opponents and your opponent swings in and say, for example, opponent 2 blocks this thing, it will die and go back to the graveyard ready to be reloaded instead of being exiled out.
Synergy is real.
Now, we do have one other big reanimation target that I want to talk about for this video, but this is going to be something that we're adding in specifically with the Spot Acceptor. Now, with the Spot Acceptor, just one more time, we can start to destroy our own toys that our opponents control, which is fantastic. One of the things that I want to bring up here is World Gorger Dragon. World Gorger Dragon is 3 a red, and a red for a creature Nightmare Dragon. It's a 7/7. It's got flying and trample, and it states when it enters the battlefield, exile all other permanents you control. It also states whenever it leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. If we can get this to reanimate underneath one of our opponent's control, first off, it's going to leave them in for a very bad day. It's going to get rid of the entire rest of their board, and that also includes their lands. The wonderful thing about this, though, is if we can reanimate this, and with its trigger on the stack, if we can kill it, it'll have its ETB effect go off and exile out their board, but the World Gorger Dragon actually won't be around anymore, so the leaves the battlefield trigger will never happen. It permanently exiles all of their things.
Seems pretty broken.
Seems fantastic. Next up, I wanted to add a little bit of protection in here. One of the things that we need for this deck is obviously our commander. This deck is one that doesn't really like to function without its commander, and I know that you could probably say that with most EDH decks, but if our commander is actually not capable of really doing his thing, our deck doesn't really work. Essentially, our backup plan is going to be able to get some of the big Eldrazi into play and just kind of hope to beat face with them, but really we want to be able to keep our commander alive and make sure that our graveyard is nice and filled with all of these wonderful reanimation targets. The first card that I'm going to include in here for protection is Deflecting Swat. Deflecting Swat is 2 and a red for an instant. It says if you control a commander, you may cast a spell without paying its mana cost. It says you may choose new targets for target spell or ability. So Deflecting Swat does a wonderful job of making sure that our commander sticks around. And it's also wonderful since we can potentially cast this thing for free in the case our commander is actually in play, so don't have to have that extra mana up. Veil of Summer is a single green for an instant. It says draw a card if an opponent has cast a blue or black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn. You and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and from black until end of turn. So it's got a wonderful little cantrip on there. It's not going to protect you from everything, but it does protect you from a pretty wide range of things in a typical game of EDH, which still makes this card, it's very good for helping to make sure that your commander sticks around.
Hey, as someone that runs Naya, I don't care.
There you go. This next category, the deck has some removal in the Precon already. However, it's really not my favorite, and we need to be a little bit more focused. We're going to be adding in a couple pieces for removal that are just kind of general blanket removal pieces, as well as some targeted removal for kind of some interesting stuff. The first card that we're going to bring in here is Assassin's Trophy. This is a black and a green for an instant. It states destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle their library. It is super important that we have something in this deck that is capable of just taking out any kind of permanent, and Assassin's Trophy does a wonderful job with that. Putrefy is 1 a black and a green for an instant. It says destroy target artifact or creature. It can't be regenerated. I like having the ability to kill the creature off with this, but I also really wanted to have a little bit more access than just that. So Putrefy does a wonderful job because it also extends its range to artifacts. Nature's Claim is a single green mana for an instant, and it says destroy target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. And Golgari Charm is a black and a green for an instant. It says choose 1. All creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. Destroy target enchantment, or regenerate each creature you control. This helps us out in the case that we're going up against, say, for example, a wide token-based strategy and that we could potentially be killing off all of their creatures. It also helps us out with that destroy target enchantment. And lastly, the third mode is still relevant in the case we may be facing a board wipe. The reason why I went with this removal suite is because one of the things that our deck is going to be really fragile to is graveyard hate. we really need to be able to kill off those artifacts and enchantments that our opponents are going to be playing that are designed to shut down the graveyard. So I really wanted to be able to find some removal that would hit most of those pieces.
That makes sense.
The pre-constructed deck, just kind of out of the box, did an absolutely wonderful job of providing virtually no ramp. so, so we've got to fix that. This deck runs green, and I can't play Jund without some mana dorks. So we're gonna throw 4 of them into this list. The first one is Birds of Paradise. For a single green mana, you get a creature bird. It's a 0/1 with flying. It says tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Ignoble Hierarch essentially does kind of that same thing for this deck. He's a single green mana for a creature goblin shaman. He's a 0/1. You can tap him to add a black, a red, or a green, which is all the colors of this deck. He's also got Exalted, but that's probably not going to come up very often. Elves of Deep Shadow is a wonderful card to be able to help make sure that we're at least going to be able to hit 2 colors of mana, green and black. For a green mana, you get a creature that can tap to add 1 black mana to your mana pool. Elves of Deep Shadow deals 1 damage to you whenever you tap him, but for the most part, that's fine. Tap him 40 times. And then lastly is good old Elvish Mystic. For a single green mana, you get a 1/1 that can tap for 1 green. With 4 of these in your deck, you should be pretty reliably able to hit at least one of these in your opening hand. You may need to mulligan once, but EDH is generally pretty friendly for mulligans. I also wanted to make sure that we have some talismans in here, and I have all 3 talismans that fit into the Jund colors. The Talisman of Resilience, of Impulse, and of Indulgence. The way that these work is each of these can come down for 2 mana, tap for 1 colorless mana, or you can tap it to have it tap for 1 of its 2 respective other colors, but it will deal 1 damage to you whenever you do. I absolutely love the talismans. I think that these are fantastic cards, and I jam them in just about every EDH deck I can find.
Yeah, the talismans are really good to mana fix in any occasion.
Yeah, especially since unlike many of the other cards that we typically see inside of these precons, like a lot of the signets, you don't actually need to pay any mana to feed into these either, so they're excellent on their own. We might need a little bit more help in getting our cards into the graveyard, so we've got a couple other cards added to the list that'll help us out with that. The first one is Thrill of Possibility. This is 1 and a red for an instant. It says as an additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Faithless Looting is kind of the king whenever it comes to this type of card. It's 1 mana for a sorcery. It says draw 2 and then discard 2 cards. It also has a flashback of 2 and a red. If you're not familiar with flashback, it says that you may cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. So this is an effect that we can abuse twice.
I feel like Faithless Looting is one of your all-time favorite cards.
It probably is, and to be completely fair, if I'm playing red in EDH, which I kind of always am, it's an auto include in the deck. I'm actually trying to think about it, and I don't know if I have a deck that doesn't have Faithless Looting in it.
There's my point.
Up next is Cathartic Reunion. This is 1 and a red for a sorcery. It says as an additional cast cost to the spell, discard 2 cards, draw 3 cards. So all 3 of these, what essentially they're going to be doing is just kind of replacing themselves. They're helping us to draw some cards, and then of course they're feeding that graveyard as well. Also included in this category, another card that I wanted to throw into the list is Life from the Loam. Life from the Loam is 1 and a green for a sorcery. It says return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand, dredge 3. In the $100 video, we talked about how we were going to throw in 2 of the other dredgers. Life from the Loam is a fantastic and probably the best at dredging out of all 3 of them. Since it's a sorcery, we can very reliably get this thing back into the graveyard, which means we don't need to sack it or hope that it dies. We'll just cast it. And it also kind of fuels itself because whenever you're dredging, you might mill over a land, which then gives you a target from Life from the Loam. Now, this deck, or this precon, I feel like suffered pretty significantly from its mana base. Out of the box, I've got to say this was Probably one of the ugliest mana bases I've seen from a Precon in a very, very long time. We're going to try to fix that.
You think that's partially because of Wizards trying to figure out how to do tricolor again?
I feel like to an extent, yes. I know that you had made a comment for the, I believe it was the Cabaretti commander deck, that
Mm-hmm.
you actually did like the Precon lands. I've just noticed that with this deck, there's a lot of lands that seem to either not tap for a color, or you have to be able to feed into them, so you have to pay to tap those lands, and I'm just not a fan. A lot of the cards in this list, a lot of the lands I noticed also came in tapped, and this is a deck that really wants to be able to set itself up as quickly as possible. I don't want to have to cast my commander on turn 6 because all of my lands were coming in tapped and slowing me down. So we're going to go ahead and try to fix this up a little bit. The first two cards that I want to talk about are both pain lands. This is Carplusian Forest and Llanowar Wastes. The way that these work is that you can tap them for a colorless mana, or you can tap them. Llanowar Waste taps for a black and a green, and then the Carplusian Forest taps for either a green or a red, and they'll deal 1 damage to you whenever you do so. These are fantastic in the early game. Losing the 1 life is really not that big of a deal, and in the later game, whenever you have other lands there to help support, you can just tap these for a colorless and not worry about having to take the damage. Fabled Passage is another card that I wanted to include in this list, just as a way for us to be able to kind of filter out through our deck and then be able to grab whichever specific color of basic land that we need. Fabled Passage is a land that you can tap, sacrifice Fabled Passage, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Then, if you control 4 or more lands, untap that land.
Good old Evolving Wilds on steroids.
There you go. It's not quite a fetch, but it's pretty good. I know I've complained about lands entering the battlefield tapped and how I didn't like them the Precon, but we've got actually a group of them that I do need to talk about and what we're going to include here to replace some of those. The first card is Dakmor Salvage. Dakmor Salvage is a land. It says it enters the battlefield tapped, which does suck. It can tap for a black, but the reason why this card's going in this list is because this is a land with Dredge too. Dredge, once again, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, and I probably should have read this off with Life from the Loam, but it states if you would draw a card, you may mill equal to the dredge, so in this case, 2 cards instead. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand. The next card that I'm going to be including in here is Zeatora's Proving Ground. This is a land that is a swamp, mountain, and forest right from Streets of New Capenna. You can tap to add 1 mana of any of the colors for Jund, and it does enter the battlefield tapped. The upside on this card is that it does have cycling 3, so if you do happen to top deck this later on in the game, totally fine. You can cycle this away to have it replace itself.
You know, it would have made too much sense for Wizard to include the tri-lands in the tri-colored commander decks.
I really feel like they did that on purpose with their omission of it because they knew you would have to go pick up or just open up packs in hopes that you would be able to get your respective triome.
Greedy.
Yeah, look at that. Company looking for money. The next 3 cards that I'm going to talk about, all 3 of which are lands as well, and I actually typically hate these cards. These cards are kind of oddly enough, I feel like always in pre-constructed decks, and I almost always take them out. But in this case, the deck that actually wants them, it didn't have them. Rakdos Carnarium, Gruul Turf, and Golgari Rot Farm all are lands that enter the battlefield tapped and state whenever they enter the battlefield, return a land you control to its owner's hand. Each of these can tap for 2 mana of different colors. Now, the reason why I say I actually like these cards for this deck is because in the early game, there's an odd interaction. If you, say, for example, play a land on turn 1 and then pass your turn on turn 2 by dropping one of these, at your end step, you'll have 8 cards in hand and it will force you to discard a card. That's wonderful for a deck that wants to be able to fuel its graveyard, because on turn 3 you're not going to be down any mana, and these might have actually helped you to throw one of your threats into the graveyard to make sure that your commander is going to be ready to go on turn 4.
Yeah, that makes sense, man.
In addition, the last couple of cards that I'm going to talk about don't actually enter the battlefield tapped, and they are all fantastic whenever it comes to fixing up some of our colors. I'm going to be including all three of the pathways in here: Darkboar Pathway, Blight Step Pathway, and Crag Crown Pathway. The way that these lands work is you can either play them for their front half, which taps for one color, or their back half, which taps for another color. So fantastic. Only thing with these is I don't actually like to I don't like to play these in the opening turns quite as much, unless I know I have each of the colors that I'm going to need. We're also going to be adding in all three of the check lands that go in for Jund, Rootbound, Crag, Woodland Cemetery, and Dragon Skull Summit. The way that these work is whenever they enter the battlefield tapped, unless you control a basic land of the type that these would tap for mana for. And then, of course, each one of these tap for one of two different kinds of mana. I had a little bit more money left over on the budget, and I wanted to continue to include a little bit more to help out this mana base. So we're going to throw an Overgrown Tomb in here as well. This is a shock land. It's a land. It is a swamp forest. You can tap for either a black or a green, and it enters the battlefield tapped unless you pay 2 life. That's fantastic. The 2 life is negligible, and because this has the forest type for the land, there actually are a couple of cards in this deck that can go and find this and put this directly into play.
Specifically, like the checks we just saw.
Well, the checks help out a lot, and the shocklands love the checklands the checklands love the shocklands because, if, say, for example, I have an Overgrown Tomb, it's both a forest and a swamp. Dragon Skull Summit can come into the battlefield untapped because of that card type.
Exactly. It's pretty great.
So those are some of the cards that I've included in here. There is a lot of cards that I've had to remove from this as well. All right, so for those of you who watched the $100 video, there are 2 cards that were included in the $100 list that are actually not going to make the cut for the $300 list. So before we dive into the other cuts that we've made, we do need to talk about these 2. The first one that we're going to give the axe to is Heartless Summoning. Heartless Summoning is 1 and a black. It's an enchantment. It says creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast, and creatures you control get -1/-1. We're no longer going to include this into the list because we're now running Mana Dorks. This would kill off our Mana Dorks, and the Mana Dorks essentially kind of function the same way, and that they help to ramp for the later and mid-range portions of the game. Deadbridge Chant is 4, a black, and a green for an enchantment. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, put the top 10 cards of your library into your graveyard. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose a card at random from your graveyard. If it's a creature card, put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, put it in your hand. We've included a couple more cards in here that we don't actually really want to reanimate, so this gets a little bit worse. And also, just for room to have some other better cards go in, we're going to take this one out.
Goodbye.
Now, the rest of the cards that we're going to be talking about removing are all cards that were originally included in the pre-constructed deck. And I do apologize, bear with me because we're going to go through a lot. All the cards that you currently see on the screen right now are going to be removed from the Precon. This was a removal or a cut that we made whenever we were designing the $100 list. If you're curious as to why it is we cut those cards at that point, go ahead, go back, watch that video, and check out our reasoning. We are going to be talking about some other cards that we cut from the pre-constructed deck to make room for additional goodies that we put in with the $300 list, and I will talk a little bit more about those cards specifically.
So what are we cutting from the Precon to make room for your other $300 list cards?
All right, so this deck straight out of the box is really not designed to work very well with the Beamtown Bullies. It's very clearly designed to work with Toolbox Tori, which makes sense. He's the face commander. So a lot of the cards that we're going to be cutting from here are either just not good reanimation targets, just generally speaking, not creatures that we actually want to have in play, or they don't help us progress our game state or our game plan in any meaningful way. The first card that I'm going to cut here is Thragtusk. Good old Thragtusk. He is 4 and a green for a creature beast. It's a 5/3, and it states whenever it enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life. Whenever it leaves the battlefield, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. I'm not about to pay 5 mana for a Thragtusk, and I am most certainly not about to give my opponent all of those extra goodies by reanimating this. Matoic Slime is 4 and a green for a creature ooze. It's a 4/4, and it says whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Put 2/2 green ooze creature tokens onto the battlefield. They have, when this creature is put into the graveyard, put 2/1/1 green ooze creature tokens onto the battlefield. If you can sacrifice this thing, then sure, maybe that would be fine. But that's not what our deck is really aiming to do, and I don't want to reanimate this either. Bellowing Mauler is 4 and a black for a creature ogre warrior. It's a 4/6, and it says at the beginning of your end step, each player loses 4 life unless they sacrifice a non-token creature. This card actually works really well with Toolbox Tori, but we're not sacrificing much from our board state. In fact, our deck actually is not designed to have much of a board state. So I don't want a card in here that's probably just going to hit me for 4 life every turn. Green Warden of Marasa is 4, a green and a creature elemental. It's a 5/4, and it states whenever it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Whenever it dies, you may exile it. If you do, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Same kind of thing here with the Toolbox Tori deck, or with it at the helm. This gets a little bit cheaper. It can come in and can abuse both its ETB and, of course, its death trigger. We're not actually capitalizing on either of those for the Beamtown Bullies, though. The next group of cards, I don't actually think they were even really all that good enough to be included in Toolbox Tori, but they're still going to get the cut here. The first one is Chaldea Guardian. This is 3 and a green for a human soldier. It's a 4/3, and it states whenever it or another creature you control with mana value 4 or greater dies, create 2/1/1 green and white citizen creature tokens. It's got a blitz effect on it as well for blitz of a 2 and a green. It's a cool card, and then it comes down and it replaces itself off of its blitz cost, plus gives you some bodies, but I'm not interested in this effect. It's a 4-drop that really isn't doing much for me, and especially in this deck, we don't care about its ability. Deathbringer Regent is 5, a black and a black for a 5/6 dragon with flying. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand and there are 5 or more other creatures on the battlefield, destroy all other creatures. It's sometimes a board wipe, but it's always 7 mana. Tamer Sabertooth is 2, a green and a green for a creature cat. It's a 4/3, and it has pay 1 and a green. You may return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Tamer Sabertooth gains indestructible until end of turn. I get that, yeah, you maybe want to be able to use this ability to bounce your blitz creatures with the Tori deck, but we're not doing any of that. And Tamer Sabertooth honestly strikes me as just kind of an odd card in general, because I'm used to just seeing this with Dockside Extortionist trying to create loops and make infinite mana. The next 3 cards, although I think 2 of which are interesting, I don't actually think any of them are good. The first one is Grime Gorger. It is 2, a black and a green for a creature horror. It's a 3/3 with menace, and it states that whenever it attacks, exile up to 1 card from each card type from defending player's graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on Grime Gorger for each card exiled this way. It's graveyard hate, and I guess that's fine, but I'm not really here for it for this deck, and we got to make some room. Overgrown Battlement is the mana dork that wish it was. It is 1 and a green for a creature wall. It's got Defender, and it can tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each creature with Defender you control, which is just going to be 1.
Only 1 in the whole deck? Wow. Seems
Now,
like it works well with each other.
now I will admit, at least, okay, in the Precon, there were 2 creatures that had Defender, but one of them was like pseudo Defender. And then there was this one. It was a card with Defender that could sometimes attack as though it did not have Defender.
It seems
So I
like
guess
it was well worth it.
Yeah, I mean, the synergy's there. Like, this thing at its ceiling could tap for 2 mana. It's not worth it. The last card here is Protection Racket. I think this is a really interesting card. I think it's a really bad card, too. It's 2 and a black for an enchantment. It states that at the beginning of your upkeep, repeat the following process for each opponent in turn order. Reveal the top card of your library. That player may pay life equal to the card's mana value. If they do, exile that card. Otherwise, put it in your hand. Now, at absolute best, this thing is drawing you an additional 3 cards per turn, which sounds fantastic. Your opponents are always going to choose to exile. Even if you flip an Eldrazi, they're going to choose to exile.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it fits well with your deck at all.
Yeah, it's preventing me from actually like feeding my graveyard and potentially taking me off my win conditions. Some other cards that are just generally off theme. The first one is Inferno Titan. This is 4 red and a red for a 6/6 creature giant. You can pay a red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn, and it states whenever it attacks, or I'm sorry, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, it deals 3 damage divided as you choose amongst 1, 2, or 3 target creatures. Inferno Titan is a totally fine card on itself, but it just doesn't synergize with anything. Mezio Mugger is 4 and a red for a 3/3 creature. It's a Viashina Rogue. It says whenever it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. You may play those cards this turn. You may spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast those spells, and it's got a blitz of 2 and a red. Disciple of Bolus is 3 and a black for a creature human wizard. It's a 2/1 that states whenever it enters the battlefield, sacrifice another creature. You gain X life and draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. We do have some big fatties in this deck, but for the most part, those are going to be entering the battlefield under our opponent's control, not actually underneath ours. Our board probably is going to be a little bit on the light side, and I definitely don't want to use this to kill our commander with, even if we would be drawing cards and gaining life. Jolene the Plunder Queen is 2, a red and a green. It's a legendary creature human warrior. She's a 2/2, and it says whenever a player attacks one or more of your opponents, that attacking player creates a treasure token. If you would create one or more treasure tokens, instead create those tokens plus an additional treasure token. It also has sacrifice 5 treasures, put 5 +1/+1 counters on Jolene. I think she's a really cool card, and I'm glad that they printed her. I just don't know what she's doing in this deck.
Yeah, she's very popular. She can rhyme all she wants. But she doesn't fit very well, does she?
No, not here. I think that she would definitely make a fantastic commander, like in and of her own deck, but I don't see much overlap between either of the pre-constructed commander, the face cards.
Yeah, she's very popular on EDH Rec right now. She is currently ranked 50, which is over the Brokers and the Cabaretti commanders.
Another card here that's just not really providing us with a whole lot of value is Lifecrafter's Bestiary. This is 3 mana for an artifact, and it states at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1. And it also has whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay a green. If you do, draw a card. I love card draw, don't get me wrong, and I actually do wish that our deck had a little bit more of it, but I don't really care about this effect. We're not actually casting a whole lot of creatures. A couple cards that I'm actually not a big fan of, and I have these listed as flexible but generally just not efficient. The first one is Riveteers Confluence. This is 2, a black, a red, and a green for a sorcery. It says choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. The first mode on this card is you draw a card and you lose 1 life. The second mode is Riveteers Confluence deals 1 damage to each creature and planeswalker you don't control. And the third mode on it says you may put a land card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. In this deck, you're probably just going to be paying the 3 life to draw 3 cards. And paying 5 mana for a sorcery to do that does not sound good.
Yeah, not really.
Windgrace's Judgment is 3, a black and a green for an instant. It says for any number of opponents, destroy target non-land permanent that player controls. This deals with a lot, and it is an instant, but it costs 5 mana. That is way too much. Riveteers Charm is a black, a red, and a green for an instant, and it states choose 1. Target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker they control with the highest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. Exile the top 3 cards of your library until your next end step. You may play those cards, or exile target player's graveyard. Same kind of thing here. It's a flexible card, and that's fine. I just don't actually think it's really all that great.
Yeah, I don't know. Riveteers Charm doesn't fit in your Riveteers deck.
It doesn't.
So what are some of the other cards that you're cutting? I see that you've got some things that were pretty hard to cut out.
Yeah, this next group was some cards that I didn't really have a problem with being in the deck and have actually either A, performed just fine for me, or a new card that was just in this list that I actually do think I kind of like. We just needed to make some space. So these got the axe. The first one here is Wave of Rats. This is 3 and a black for a creature rat. It's a 4/2 with trample, and it states when it dies, if it dealt combat damage to a player this turn, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. It has Blitz of 4 and a black. From playtesting around with this card, I actually really like this one. The Blitz effect is pretty solid. It replaces itself, and typically, because it's a 4/2 with trample, it gets in for damage. So if it dies, it comes back. Garruk's Uprising is another card that I'm actually a fan of. I just needed to make some room here. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. It says creatures you control have trample. It also says whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This is a fantastic engine that we'll probably only be able to get one card off of, and that just being off our commander. If things are going absolutely awful for us, then we can hard cast some of the Eldrazi, some of the big drops in our deck, and I guess we could draw cards off them. But if we're doing that, this game is probably not going well for us. Commander Sphere is another card that I'm going to make a cut here. I replaced this with one of the talismans that we talked about earlier. Commander Sphere is 3 mana for an artifact. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color of your commander color identity. You can also sacrifice it to draw a card. It's a fantastic effect, and it's not a bad card. I just replaced it with something I thought was a little bit more efficient. Solemn Simulacrum is also on this list of hard cuts. For 4 mana, you get an artifact creature golem. It's a 2/2. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. And whenever it dies, you can draw a card. Great little mana fixer there, and it cantrips to replace itself whenever it's time for a Sad Robot to go, but I needed to make some room.
You're making Sad Robot sad by cutting him.
Speaking of sad robots, I have one more sad robot to talk about. This one is Noxious Gear Hulk. It's 4 a black and a black. It's an artifact creature construct. It's a 5/4 with menace, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may destroy another target creature. If a creature is destroyed this way, you gain life equal to its toughness. I love the ETB on this card. I'm never going to be able to reanimate it because my opponent's probably just going to kill my commander with it, and I would rather just have drawn something else.
Yeah, I can see why all 5 of these cards were pretty hard to cut.
They're all fantastic cards in their own right. It's just they weren't necessarily working with the synergy of the deck, or I just needed to make some extra room.
Speaking of extra room, you added quite a bit of lands. So what are the lands you're taking out to make room for the ones you added?
Oh boy, as I mentioned beforehand, the pre-constructed list has a lot of, well, awful lands. We're going to gut a lot of them. Jun Panorama isn't actually the worst one in the group, but it's going to get the axe. It's a land that can tap for 1 colorless mana. You can pay 1 and tap it, as well as sacrifice it to search your library for a basic swamp, mountain, or forest and put that onto the battlefield tapped. So it is a land that either doesn't tap for a color, or it goes and finds you another land that comes in tapped. It's slow. I don't like it. Temple of the False God is probably the ultimate trap card. I feel like a lot of newer players gravitate towards this one and love this card at first. This card is absolutely awful. You can tap it to add 2 colorless mana. However, you can only activate it if you control 5 or more lands, which means this is the worst thing you can have in your opening hand. Cinderglade is a land, it's a mountain forest, so it has the keywords going for it there. It says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. I don't like that. It's going to come in tapped the majority of the time. Foreboding Ruins and Game Trail are both going to get the axe here. The way that these work is whenever they enter the battlefield, you may reveal either a mountain or forest for Game Trail, or a swamp or mountain for Foreboding Ruin. If you don't, they're going to enter the battlefield tapped. So also another card that's dependent on you having, well, in this case, for the basic land, or a basic land in the pre-constructed decks. Casting Wolfrun is another card that I'm going to get the axe here as well. It taps for a colorless, or you can pay X, a red, and a green to give target creature plus X plus O and trample until end of turn. We're not going to be doing a ton of attacking with our own things, so I don't really care about this.
That's. Do you have any more lands you're trying to cut?
Oh, yes, we do. Mossfire Valley and Shadowblood Ridge are both lands that you have to pay mana to tap. They actually don't produce mana without the help of something else. They can potentially like filter for you, but these cards are awful. For example, Shadow Blood Ridge, the way that it works is you pay 1 mana, you can tap it, and you add a black or a red. Mossfire Valley does the same thing, but for red and for green. These cards are horrible on their own. They're dependent on another land, and seeing as how so many of our lands enter the battlefield tapped already, I don't want to have this come in and then a tapped land come in and then realizing that, wait a second, it's turn 3 and I've not had access to any mana yet. This next group of lands are the Thriving lands from this pre-constructed deck: Thriving Bluff, Thriving Grove, and Thriving Moor. All 3 of these enter the battlefield tapped. Whenever they enter the battlefield, you choose a color other than the one that they can tap for, and then they can each tap for one of the respective Jund colors on their own. These are tapped lands that I personally feel are just a little bit better than Gates, but really not by much. The last 2 lands that we're going to cut here are both of our hideaway lands. I actually really don't like the hideaway mechanic. For the most part, I feel like I never actually am super stoked to tuck any card under any of these lands, because they have a stipulation that isn't always necessarily the easiest thing. Plus, if you happen to tuck a card underneath that would benefit from having a specific time for you to be able to cast it, there's some timing restrictions on these cards as well as to when it is you can actually get the hideaway card to activate. So, not a big fan of either of these lands. Lastly, although not a bad land, it is something we do need to at least kind of talk about because I did replace one of them. I did cut one mountain from this list. I know I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of cutting the basic lands, but I feel like we kind of made a switch for something a little bit better. That mountain is actually what I ended up cutting to put in the Overgrown Tomb.
That's a little better, I'd say.
A little bit better.
Alrighty, Dave. Is that it?
That is it. We have only entirely changed just about everything about this deck, but yep, that's all.
So here's my question to you, because you've already hinted at that you're already making this deck to play against our group, which I can't wait. I'm afraid of this deck. How fun would you say this deck is?
To play or to play against?
Play.
If you like doing silly shenanigans, I think this deck would be fantastic. This is a deck that actually does have a fair amount of explosiveness to it, and it is completely possible that you can kill a player on turn 4. At the same time, there's some weird politics with this commander where you kind of create this odd environment. Beamtown Bullies can only activate on an opponent's turn, and he can only activate respective to that opponent. So, for example, if it is opponent A's turn and they see something in your graveyard, they might be incentivized to kill the Beamtown Bullies because they don't know, hey, look, are you going to reanimate something on that turn? At the same time, however, opponent B and opponent C may not actually want to interact because they know, hey, it's got to go through opponent A's turn first, and Beamtown, I don't know, maybe loaded up with something like a leveler in the graveyard.
Yeah. I would. Can't wait to get hit with the leveler because I already know you're going to hit me with it.
Fantastic. Yep, absolutely.
Any final thoughts before we head out here?
Um, I have some final thoughts with this deck, but I actually don't really want to go over it because I feel like this video is going to be long enough as is. I do think it's a fun deck. I do apologize, and I feel kind of bad, and then I feel like that we completely gutted the Precon at this point and have swapped just about every card out of it.
I wouldn't say every card. I mean, a lot of the lands. I think if you just upgraded the lands, it's not that many cards. Like if you just, I mean, take out the lands.
I mean, in total, between the $100 and $300 list, there were nearly 50 switches.
100 card deck. That's not all the cards, is it?
That's a pretty significant number.
50%.
On the bright side, however, for those of you who are looking to put this deck together, if you do want to keep it around with that clunky mana base, this is a deck that I had the opportunity to switch out a lot of lands in the $300 build, and I chose to do it because I do think that it actually does make the deck better. But if you're willing to play around with that clunky mana base, you can upgrade this deck for a surprisingly cheap amount.
I think a lot of people would be very excited to build this deck. Down in the description below, you'll find a link to our Moxfield account where you can find David's entire deck list to this $300 upgrade of the Beamtown Bullies. And as always, if you liked the video, hit that like button. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Comment down below if you agree with David's cuts or additions, or if you hate this, let us know too. All feedback is always welcome. Follow us on our Instagram and our Twitter. That is at Guys That Magic. We are coming up to spoiler season for Commander Legends 2. So that's going to be exciting. Coming out with that soon. You'll see all of the spoilers on our Instagram. So follow along there. And as always, we will see you guys in the next video. Hope you guys have a great day. Peace.
Bye.